What's up, Rovers? I've been wanting to make this video for a while as I've been getting this question a lot. I've been busy working on other projects as well as traveling. I hope this video can answer the question once and for all: is Shorekeeper always better than Verina? And are there teams where Verina would be better? The truth is, there are actually quite a few situations where Verina is better. To better understand this video, we need to break down what each of these 5-star supports offer, as well as their limitations. I'll be using S0 Shorekeeper as the baseline for discussing benefits and issues today, and where relevant, we'll mention where her S1 can solve some, but not all problems. Note that I will not be including Abijah in this analysis as she has a near identical kit to Verina, just slower and lower modifiers. There is a very important spreadsheet used to explain the final section of team rotations that will be linked in the description. Do note that this discussion also assumes full rotations and cannot account for mid-rotation clear scenarios. Alright, let's start with our ever-familiar Tree Whisperer. Verina has been, and still is, the golden standard for support characters. Good heals, multiple useful buffs with low investment, fast concerto generation, and flexible playstyles allow quick swaps and intro being unnecessary. For most players these days, there are two main things they focus on for supports: how good are their buffs, and how fast can they produce concerto to swap towards the DPS units. So let's break this down. Verina grants 20% attack to the entire team for 20 seconds. Whenever she uses a heavy attack, mid-air attack, ults, or outros. Realistically, the two most consistent are mid-air, because it's the fastest way to dump the last of her fortes to build concerto, and casting outro, because her outro itself already grants a massive final damage buff to her team that you always want to use. Therefore, Verina can very consistently grant plus 20% attack for 20 seconds, and 15% total damage amp for 30 seconds. As a bonus, her Liberation grants coordinated damage, so far only useful really for Jinhsi. Her heals are very bursty in the 10 to 15k range on a full build, mainly focused on when you consume forte stacks, but this means she is not reliant on her ult or skill to heal. The more aggressive the enemy, the faster she generates forte stacks, the more she can heal. Verina rotations are typically very fast, since she was not designed to require both the concerto from her intro and liberation to complete her rotation. Just intro or liberation is enough. This means that with enough energy recharge, she can reliably ult every rotation without wasting the time of the intro animation, which barely does anything for her. If you dodge counter once, you don't need liberation or intro at all. The typical non-intro rotation is swap in, which puts you at basic 3 already, then you basic out to 5 for the forte stack. It is barely slower than her actual intro skill and also generates 1 forte as well, while producing 15 concerto instead of 10, just under 4 seconds. Of course, if you have her S2, you can just skill and spam aerial to charge in 2 seconds or less, because her S2 is just that crazy. But how about Shorekeeper, our newest 5-star? In terms of raw damage buffs, Shorekeeper is superior, granting crit buffs instead of attack buffs. But we also need to know where it comes from. Unlike Verina, who sources her attack percent buff from mid-air attacks, liberation, or outro, Shorekeeper's crit buff only comes from her liberation. Therefore, you do not have the option to decide between intro or liberation, because you need her liberation always. On the bright side, her crit buffs are superior, with every percent point of crit rate, or 2% crit damage, worth about 1.7 times each percentage of attack when parsing team damage. In other words, Shorekeeper's 12.5 crit rate and 25 crit damage is worth about 42 to 43% attack as a rough guideline. Remember that Verina only brings 20% attack. However, Shorekeeper's crit buffs are staged, requiring 1 intro to give the crit rate buff, and 2 intros to give crit damage. This means that in dual DPS comps, Shorekeeper's crit damage buff will not be active for a substantial portion of 1 DPS. This is also why making dual DPS quick swap comps for Shorekeeper are hard, because you need to balance it with when her crit damage buff becomes available. Therefore, in practice, her crit buffs are actually worth somewhat less than 42% attack, since they take time to activate, whereas Verina's attack buff, despite being only 20%, is fully active immediately when she swaps off. The other element of Shorekeeper's kit is her special intro skill when used with a golden, or stage 3, Stella round. This lets her deal big AoE HP scaling spectro damage on intro skill instead of a normal tiny non-existent damage. Therefore, failing to cast special intro skill on Shorekeeper is also a noticeable damage loss, about 30 to 50k depending on normal investment. Conclusion? Her intro skill, the special one, is also super important, which means she needs both intro skill and liberation every single rotation to hold her competitive edge. Shorekeeper's own rotation is relatively fast, but still noticeably slower than Verina. Assuming you cast her intro, this is typically followed up with 4 basic attacks, cancelling the heavy with the liberation, then skill plus echo and outro. You also have to delay after a skill cast by 0.3 seconds to produce the butterflies, otherwise you won't get the 10 bonus concerto needed for smooth rotations. And you also can't skill cast all the way at the end and swap up early, because again, you need to wait for the dim star butterflies to hit to actually get the last 10 concerto. Regardless, all of these variations typically take 6 seconds, or importantly, about 2.5 seconds slower than Verina, and this will come into play later. For heals, while Shorekeeper cannot instantly heal 10 to 15k like Verina can, she instead has a steady heal over time for the entire duration of her liberation. Her skill heal is her only other source, tied to a 16 seconds cooldown, but gives 5 to 6,000 HP a pop. This means that she cannot get more heals from building Forte off dodge counters on aggressive enemies like Verina. On the other hand, if you don't get hit as often, her 2000 to 2.5k heal every 3 seconds outscales Verina's heal over time and is really good for dealing with chip damage passively at any part of your team rotation. What conclusions can we draw today from these observations for heals, damage, buffs, and rotations? For heals, Verina has better burst heals, but lower total heal over time than Shorekeeper. For damage, Verina basically deals 0 damage, whereas Shorekeeper can contribute enough to be relevant, but isn't amazing. She contributes usually about 5 to 6% of your team's total damage output. For buffs, Shorekeeper brings better stats, being crit instead of Verina's attack buffs. However, they're not as good as they seem for 2 reasons. The first is that it takes time to activate both crit buffs on Shorekeeper, meaning they are worth somewhat less than 42% attack, as I stated earlier, closing the gap to Verina's 20% attack buff. The second reason is that attack percent is a very diluted stat naturally already. This means that Verina's attack buff is resistant to further dilution since it already is very diluted. Think adding 10% attack to 200% scaling makes less a difference than adding 10% of a different stat into 150% scaling. Verina's buffs remain almost the same throughout your journey, but Shorekeepers slowly lose value as your account grows. Why? Because most of your attack percent comes from early sources, like echo main stats and weapon main stats. Very little of your attack percent actually comes from substats. On the other hand, most crits on builds are only achieved in late game, coming from your echo substats. So what does this mean in the long run? As we get more sub DPS in the future, if any of them give crit percent instead of attack percent, this will negatively impact Shorekeeper more than Verina. Now, this doesn't mean that Shorekeeper's buffs are bad. The inverse of this is also true. Because crit is not very diluted yet, Shorekeeper's buffs out the gate are noticeably stronger than Verina, especially when your account is newer and you lack crit substats. But it does mean that as the game grows and your accounts too, Shorekeeper's shiny new status will settle down much closer to Verina than she is right now. They will still probably be the best pure supports we have for somewhere around the first half a year to full year of the game's release. In other words, regardless of power creep, the more your account grows, the less of an advantage Shorekeeper has over Verina. For rotations, this is where things get complicated. We have established that Verina's standard rotation takes 4 seconds or less and does not require intro. This is very important because it can let you double intro onto units who desire it a lot more to ease their rotations, such as Havoc Rover, Mortefi, Changli, Taochi, Judge, and all units who are somewhat slower to charge Concerto require mandatory full Forte bars, build Forte bar off casting intro skill, or allow them to access a vital part of their kit much faster and thus normally saves 2 to 4 seconds. Heck, even Calchero benefits from double intro to make his Concerto cycle less borderline even if not necessary. Regardless, the double intro setup is not possible with Shorekeeper. This is because you will generally outro the non-DPS unit onto the DPS so you can unload all your damage at once with Shorekeeper's strongest Golden Stellar Realm active. The only exception to this rule at S0 are Jinhsi teams, who can run 4 intros per rotation instead of 3. Not introing onto Shorekeeper at the end also means she loses her 30 to 50k hit, which is one of her biggest benefits that Verina lacks. Therefore, every single Shorekeeper team, regardless of your intermediate quick swap, always will still outro Shorekeeper onto your second unit, who pretty much always generates Concerto faster than your third unit and thus is forced to outro onto your third unit. Then, you are forced to outro your third unit back onto Shorekeeper to deal her big hit and reset, with very few exceptions like Jinhsi. On Verina, you could outro your third unit instead back onto your second, such as onto Changli in a Changli Encore team, Changli Qixia, or Changli Yao teams, to gain +1 Forte stack, or onto Mortefi in Mortefi GN teams, to give a big chunk of his Forte bar pre-filled in Concerto as his basic attacks generate Concerto poorly. The amount of time saved doing this typically massively outweighs introing onto Verina, saving about 2 to 4 seconds on most team comps and actually even dealing extra damage. Then comes the second big difference for rotations. Shorekeeper teams are always on the clock, preferring to cycle every 25 seconds if possible, since that's the earliest she can cast her liberation buffs again. It is not logical to rotate Shorekeeper teams faster than 25 seconds outside of a 1-2 seconds leeway for dodges, because she literally cannot refresh her Stellar Realm before then, and even her S1 only extends her Stellar Realm to 40 seconds, and not end during her intro, but is still far less than 2 full team rotations. It is possible to run her S1 on sub 25 seconds teams in ways that can surpass Verina, but it gets very complicated because her liberation and personal rotation gets offset from the team by an additional 5 seconds every time your team cycles. This is not achievable for the average player, nor is it a playstyle I'd be willing to do myself. Therefore, it is assumed the standard Shorekeeper team cannot rotate faster than 25 seconds. This causes 2 very big problems for Shorekeeper teams. The first makes her incompatible with 2-unit teams, because her special intro requires 3 intros. 2-unit teams will do the third intro back onto the DPS and thus requires 4 intros to cycle back onto Shorekeeper. This is not possible for most main DPS because their liberation and main DPS tools that generate a lot of Concerto will still be on cooldown. Verina, on the other hand, does not care about intros and has no strict timer for her team rotations, and thus is much more compatible for 2-unit teams. The second problem with Shorekeeper's 25 seconds rotation has to do with team rotation speeds. We established much earlier on that Verina completes her rotation roughly 2 to 2.5 seconds faster than Shorekeeper, which makes the entire team cycle 2 to 2.5 seconds faster. We also established that double intro setups can shave an additional 2 to 4 seconds on relevant team comps, and even gain damage on a per hit basis by reducing the amount of time the middle unit needs to charge their Forte bar and Concerto before getting to your main DPS. Therefore, what happens when you end up with Verina teams that can cycle 4 to 6 seconds faster than the equivalent Shorekeeper team? Does Shorekeeper's 30 to 50k raw damage and slightly stronger buffs in the form of crit do enough to close the gap? How do you know which teams can even do this? This is where my team rotation chart comes in. Disclaimer, this chart assumes you're playing the most common rotations for the relevant teams properly. The worse you play, the less a speed advantage Verina teams will have, and conversely, the better Shorekeeper team becomes relatively. To read this chart, look at any unit on the top row. The colored bar segments represent their fastest, all the way down to their slowest iterations involving that unit. The thick black line is the Shorekeeper reference, as she cannot rotate faster than this. So basically, pick a 3-unit team and see the shortest time possible that has all 3 bars still present for all 3 units. That's the time taken for optimal rotations on that team. For example, if we look at Changli Encore, that's these columns. If I run the 2 of them with Shorekeeper, the fastest this team can go is 25 seconds, the black line. If I instead want to run this team with Verina, it's still only 24 seconds. Thus, Verina Changli Encore at most can only run 1 second faster than Shorekeeper variant according to this chart. This is because Changli's fastest rotations still require her to cast her skill twice, which each have a 12 seconds cooldown and thus take 24 seconds to fully recharge. Therefore, Shorekeeper would definitely be an improvement over Verina in a Changli Encore team, since Verina only has a 1 second speed advantage to compensate Shorekeeper's better crit buffs. In reality, the Shorekeeper version is about 26 to 27 seconds, but it's not enough difference to matter here. Know that this chart does not factor in rotation complexity and assumes you can play all rotations fine. Generally, optimal Shorekeeper teams are actually a fair bit more complicated than Verina, since it requires more quick swap to cut down on time but still obeying all the extra rules that Shorekeeper teams follow. But what if I look at a different team instead? How about Sanhua Encore? With Shorekeeper, it's clear that I still cannot rotate faster than once every 25 seconds, since that's how often Shorekeeper can cast her Liberation for crit buffs. But what if I pick Verina? This team can go all the way down to 19 seconds. For the average Sanhua Encore enjoyer, it's more likely they will play a 20 to 21 seconds rotation. But it's clear that Sanhua Encore can rotate roughly 5 seconds faster with Verina versus Shorekeeper. That's 20% faster rotations, or in other words, you can get back to Encore's main DPS 20% faster. This gap is bigger than the buffs that Shorekeeper can cover, and thus indicates that Sanhua Encore is significantly better on Verina instead of Shorekeeper. There are many other teams where this occurs too, completely ignoring the fact that Verina is easier to play on Sanhua Encore than Shorekeeper, as seen in the small table to the left. The most common elements are Sanhua's sub-DPS or Yinlin with a fast main DPS. The main DPS also has to have a cooldown of 20 seconds or less on their main DPS tool, for example commonly Liberation or Skill. Donjin main DPS that runs with a Hyperburst 6 seconds Havoc Rover rotation, for example, works because all of their cooldowns are 16 seconds or faster and Donjin's own rotation is only 11 seconds or less. In other cases, Verina still becomes equal to Shorekeeper rather than better. Say, Mortefi GN with Verina can cycle in 21 seconds, commonly 22. The Shorekeeper variant can only rotate once every 25 to 26. This results in both variants having roughly equal DPS, and in Tower means you can use Verina for this team, and save Shorekeeper for a team where she is clearly the better choice. Now, the Jinhsi situation I left for last because it's a bit weird. Both Shorekeeper at S0 and Verina can pull off double Epiphany when played well. You don't need a Shorekeeper's S1, but it will need some practice. However, Shorekeeper Jinhsi teams typically only reach 40 incandescent stacks when played well, whereas the Verina variant consistently reaches 50 stacks in the same time. This discrepancy is enough that even though that Verina and Shorekeeper teams on Jinhsi have very similar rotation times between 28 to 30 seconds, they result in very similar damage. If you're failing to complete the double Epiphany rotation on Shorekeeper though, then Verina instantly becomes a much better choice unless you pick up Shorekeeper's S1. TLDR, if the Verina version of the team is only 3 seconds or less faster than Shorekeeper version, then Shorekeeper is generally still better. If the Verina team is 3 to 4 seconds faster than Shorekeeper, then they are generally equal. If the Verina team is easily at least 4 seconds faster than the Shorekeeper version, then the Verina teams will almost always be better. Hopefully this chart can give a clear indicator on whether or not Shorekeeper is actually a noticeable DPS gain over Verina for any given team. Interestingly, it seems Kuro has been giving more recent limited DPS longer cooldowns on important kit tools, like Yao's Liberation, to prevent us from running uber fast rotations like Sanhua Encore or GN Mortefi, etc. This prevents newer DPS from completely outclassing old era DPS, but at the same time also means that Verina cannot take advantage of faster team rotations on newer units, and thus falls behind Shorekeeper for all Changli, Yao, and Changli teams, if we completely disregard the extra rotation complexity. Whether or not Kuro continues to release units with 24 or 25 seconds cooldowns as the standard remains to be seen in the future. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. Don't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this one. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you all next time.